Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we're going to go back to the channel Things I Care About today. He's got a video that came out about a month ago about the War of 1812. This is a topic that isn't covered really in depth in American history, but I think is really important for especially the context in which it happens, which is right in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, but also for what the end of that war means for the United States and the British going forward. So I thought it'd be a good one to check out. I'll put a link down in the description so you can check that out, as well as all of the Things I Care About's other content without my commentary. He does make no secret of the fact that he models his channel after Oversimplified. His style, even the animation and the narration. He's obviously not American, but I think he does a great job with narrating the videos. So we're going to dive into this one. It's a 40-minute video, 39-minute video, so I'm probably going to divide this into a two-part reaction. So we'll do the first half today, second half tomorrow. Let's dive in.
After another great day serving President Madison of the young US of A, finally I can rest. Wait, did I turn off the stove? Uh-oh. Thomas, we need to get out of here. The British are burning down the White House. Oh, thank God. What? Nothing. Nothing.
One thing, and it's not a big deal, really, it's not, but I don't think it was called the White House yet. It was called the Executive Mansion. It actually starts getting called the White House in part because it got painted white after this, and there's actually a spot, I think, at the White House where you can still see the burn marks that weren't painted over from when it was burned during the War of 1812.
By the early 1800s, the US had only recently become independent. But it was not the strong, confident country it is today. Back then, the US was an edgy 20-year-old country, completely inexperienced at running a democratic government, and indebted because of their student loans. Because of the Revolutionary War. But most important of all, the US was very, very insecure.
So, insecure, anyway. So a lot has been made of the whole debt situation in the aftermath of the American Revolution. The United States is under the Articles of Confederation, which is kind of a loose confederation in which basically it was 13 independent nations that kind of loosely bound themselves together. But they knew they needed a more central government, and so they form one. And after the Constitution is ratified and George Washington becomes president and he makes Alexander Hamilton the first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton works with Madison and Jefferson to come up with this debt assumption plan where the federal government acquires the debt of all the states and kind of consolidates it as a federal debt, which of course gives the federal government then a lot of power. And it's very complicated how that all went down, but yeah, the federal government has acquired all that debt.
They didn't have the vibrant diversity of political parties and candidates it has today. They had the Federalist, anti-democratic Republican Party, not to be confused with these Democrats, these Republicans, or these other Republicans. Anyways, the Federalist Party was in power, and they believed that the best way to avoid war was to be prepared for it. So they spent a lot of money on building a navy, coastal fortifications, and expanding the peacetime army.
Yeah, so the building of the navy, which really the only Federalist president that there ever is John Adams, because even though George Washington, kind of his policies were in line with the Federalist Party, he himself was not a party guy at all. In fact, he hated the idea of political parties. John Adams, a big reason why he starts getting the Navy going, which the U.S. doesn't really have much of a Navy before that, is that there's this quasi-war with France, and I'm sure he'll get into that. But the parties, while they had a very different view on the nature of the federal government, they also had a very different view on who the United States should be most closely allied with. The Federalists wanted to closely ally themselves with Britain, but of course the Democratic Republicans, who leaned much more heavily with our ally from the Revolutionary War, the French, saw that as a betrayal of the revolution, that they were just resubmitting themselves to to the British, the people they had just fought a war against. And so there's that kind of pull going on, as well as all the domestic stuff.
To fund all this and pay off their massive debt, they imposed a lot of taxes and created a national bank. But wait, it's been more than 5 minutes since the last French-British war. And after the French Revolution, it's time for another one.
Yep.
So the British need all the sailors they can get for their voluptuous navy.
The British are the primary movers behind all of the wars of the coalitions first against revolutionary France and then later against Napoleon.
A slight problem though. The Americans have started to trade with everyone.
So I really appreciate,
though.
I want to go back this map, because check it out. You've got the areas that the United States claims as territory in lighter colors here. But then the ones that are actually states, you have in this orangish color here. And it's kind of interesting when you think about Louisiana is the 18th state that's admitted to the Union. The first 13 colonies, and then you add Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. I don't know if that's the right order. I know Ohio's 17th. But then Louisiana is the 18th. And so Ohio's admitted in 1803, Louisiana in I think in 1812, right before the war starts. And then you don't have any new states for 6, 7, 8 years. And then you have a whole slew of them at the end of the decade, like Mississippi, Indiana, Illinois. I think 5 or 6 states get added in the span of 5 years. So it's dramatic growth. But right now you got Louisiana sitting all there by themselves.
Americans have started to trade with everyone and are offering great deals to any sailor willing to join their merchant fleet.
Yeah.
They offer much better salaries and working conditions than what British conscripts could expect in the Royal Navy, with the added benefit of not getting randomly blown up by French cannon fire. So many British sailors found their way into American ships, which pissed off the tea-loving government. To fix this, British ships began to board American merchant vessels and forcefully reclaim their subjects to conscript them into the Navy. This was a major violation of American sovereignty, and sometimes
this is easily something that can lead to a war in and of itself, and has led to wars at other times in history. Something somewhat similar happens between the U.S. and the British during the American Civil War, when an American Navy ship stops a Confederate vessel, or it's a British vessel that's carrying Confederate diplomats. It's called the Trent Affair, and it could have led to war between the countries.
Ships dangerously short-handed. But it also had another layer of trouble. You see, distinguishing an American citizen from a British subject was not always easy to do.
Right.
And many times, the British wrongfully impressed American citizens into...
And what if you were a British subject who had emigrated to the United States and had been living in the United States for years, still had a British accent, and then enlisted in the Navy? That was a very common thing that happened. There's no way. This is a time in history when you don't just have passports and you don't have identification cards with your photo on it. It's not that simple to tell who's who.
The British Navy. You know we could prevent all this if your citizens carried some sort of proof of citizenship, right? That's a great idea. I will issue documents that describe their appearance broadly, since we haven't invented photos yet. That's good enough, right? I mean, what could possibly go wrong?
They're the same person.
Can I help you?
One has a blue shirt or blue jacket and a hat, and the other one has a red one. They're the same person.
You kind of look like me.
Yep.
I mean, we all do. Nick sucks at drawing. Yes, but you more than the others.
I can appreciate that because I really suck at drawing. I struggle with stick figures, so I think this is fantastic drawing.
Okay. Can I buy your ID for $1? What? The ID system is the only thing preventing us from getting wrongfully impressed. Selling it to you would undermine the trust that it is built on. You think I will do that for a mere $1?
Heck yeah.
What if I make it 2? Deal. Nice. I mean, what's the worst that could happen, right? It's not like our countries would go to war over this, right? Yeah, about that. The misuse of the system made it even harder for the British to distinguish between British and Americans.
The USA pinky promises that Thomas is a US citizen. That's funny.
Even when they did make an effort. And although the British did make honest efforts to repatriate wrongly impressed Americans, this process could take years. These poor Americans would have given anything to hide their identity from the British. Because of the war, the Brits also restricted the US's ability to trade with the French. So the Federalist government signed a treaty with the Brits, which significantly improved relations between the nations and allowed the US economy to flourish.
So this is 1794 Jay Treaty. John Jay is one of the kind of the forgotten founding fathers. Maybe they need to make a musical about him like Hamilton so we can remember him. Helped write a lot of the Federalist Papers, ends up Supreme Court. But he's from New York, and this is way, way back. I mean, this is early part of it's about the middle of George Washington's administration as president. And he had a lot of latitude to negotiate this himself. And these were the kinds of things that the United States as a brand new country is having to do to get themselves off on the right foot. And they're dealing with neutrality. I mean, Washington wanted badly to stay neutral between all the European conflicts. And this is kind of the precursor to the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically we're staying out of Europe and we want Europe to stay out of North and South America. So they're trying to establish all of this right now. And this is, look at this. This is 18 years before the War of 1812. But this is all part of the foundation for what's to come.
Thanks to naval trade. But it did not address the key issue of impressment. Republicans seriously disliked the treaty, seeing the friendliness to the British as the first step of being recolonized.
Yeah, and this is the same viewpoint that then the Federalists had about the Democratic Republicans, which is, well, they're just going to make us subservient to the French. And they both kind of made those accusations at each other.
And you know who else?
And in 1794, you're not dealing with the same French government that you had negotiated the alliance with during the Revolution. Louis XVI is executed. This is revolutionary France now. You're a couple of years away from Napoleon taking over.
Is mad at the treaty? The French, who saw it as a betrayal of their alliance since the Revolutionary War. So, during the almost kinda sort of a war, the French unleashed their warships and privateers to raid American commerce. But the trade was so lucrative that the French barely dented the profit. Alright man, I don't think either of us are gaining anything from this almost kinda sort of a war, so how about we agree that I will stop raiding you if you waive any claims to compensation for damages?
U.S. is just bathing in the money and not even paying any attention.
Wait, you were raiding me?
And like I said, though, the quasi-war does lead to John Adams beefing up the Navy. And that's, sometimes the event itself is not necessarily a big deal, but what the event causes can have a lasting effect down the road.
At the end of the almost kinda sort of a war, the US commerce continued to bloom, benefiting from their neutrality. But despite the thriving economy, the Federalists somehow lost the 1800s elections. Well, on second thought, maybe it was because they were seen as massive Brit lovers in a time of rising Anglophobia.
And you passed the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams' term, which heavily was directed toward French citizens who, many of whom were like burning Americans in effigy. And you have the XYZ affair where you have like money changing hands to try and get influence and all this kind of stuff happening. And so the John Adams government was really cracking down on what it saw as an overt amount of French diplomatic influence on the situation.
And a lot of people did hate them because of their harsh taxes and sedition laws. I guess it also didn't help that they were insanely elitist while the nation was striving for democracy and justice for all. Except for black people and natives, of course. So democracy and justice for all white people. And like, white. So no Irish
and males.
No Italians. Or Poles. Or Jews. Or Muslims. So democracy and justice for all real white people. As long as they are men, of course. And not gay. And also not. Finally, we are in power. Now we can start working on our country's debt. So let's start some change around here, right guys? Garbage, 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 and garbage.
Yeah, they didn't get rid of all the alien and sedition laws, and they didn't really undo much of Hamilton's financial plans. But yeah, a lot of that other stuff they did.
The army? We don't need to spend money on that. It's not like we're gonna go to war with the British again in 12 years or something.
Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans saw a standing army as a sign of tyranny by the government, and as the party that wanted a weaker central government in favor of a stronger state government, they saw an army as one of the things that had to go.
They're too busy fighting the French every 5 minutes. What are they gonna do anyways? Burn down the White House?
Okay, so what did he say here?
What are they gonna do anyways? Burn down the White House?
The White House was called the Presidential Palace, Mansion, or House before being renamed to the Executive Mansion. The name White House came in 1901, but since everyone refers to it like that today, just call it the White House in this video. All right, fair enough. That makes sense.
White House? The Republicans gutted the Navy and let go of many good Army officers.
And I do like that he's calling them Republicans. We refer to them today as the Democratic Republicans to differentiate them from the modern Republican Party, which didn't come about until the 1850s. But they did call themselves Republicans. They didn't call themselves Democratic Republicans.
The remaining officials were so incompetent that the army itself might as well have been disbanded. Their plan was to rely on militias and privateers, which were much cheaper and only needed to be paid when called upon. Privateers, which were private ships that harassed enemy commerce, could even bring in revenue if their bounty was taxed. Ah, what a lovely day it is here in 1807 aboard the USS Chesapeake. Why does the captain say that every day? Hello, mate. I've heard you guys have 4 of ours on board. Kindly let us board to reclaim them on behalf of the Royal Navy.
He's got God Save the King playing in the background. I love it.
You will do no such thing. We fought a war to be free from your tyranny. Give me liberty or give me death. It's them. The Chesapeake incident infuriated the American public, especially because 3 of the 4 British sailors were actually Americans who had deserted the Royal Navy after having been wrongfully impressed. And although the British offered to pay reparations and free the
what you have here is you have men who were American, were impressed into the British Navy, and then deserted from the British Navy that they never should have been in the first place. So then the British were like, see, they were British sailors. We had them in our Navy, and they deserted. Well, yeah, they deserted because you took them in the first place. This is why this is all such a mess. And you see how this is 1807. It doesn't lead directly to war. There's a building of this over the years as it continues to happen. And it does get addressed in Parliament while all this is going down.
Americans. The damage had already been done. Uh-oh. Now that Napoleon is in power, France and Britain have gone to war again. And again, Britain doesn't want France to be trading with its colonies. So the US cleverly starts shipping exports from the French Indies to France, bypassing the British blockade and making tons of money. But the British did not like this one bit, so they passed the Essex Decision, crippling the American re-exporting industry.
And you see how all of this is tied together, right? No Napoleonic Wars, probably no War of 1812. Napoleonic Wars do a number of things. Number one, it means Napoleon ends up selling the Louisiana Territory, which he had just acquired from Spain, to the Americans, and so that doubles the size of the United States territory. Napoleon's navy loses at the Battle of Trafalgar, which gives the British naval supremacy in the region. And yeah, now they're going to blockade the continent, and that's going to lead to Napoleon's continental system. And so yeah, people try to get around this blockade by sailing under neutral flags that aren't at war with the British. And so the British decide, well, we know they're getting around it, so we're going to start stopping these neutral ships. And that just ticks everybody off.
the US and Britain almost signed a treaty in which the British made significant concessions to the Americans.
Yeah, so British will maybe stop raiding American commerce unless they feel like raiding you, or if Mercury is in retrograde. Impressment will stop unless the Brits need more sailors, which they do, so it may not stop. Actually, it may increase.
But since they still refused to end impressment, President Jefferson did not submit the treaty to the US Senate.
And remember, Jefferson's a pro-France guy. He's naturally kind of anti-British anyway.
In 1805, Britain beat France's butt at Trafalgar, becoming the undisputed master of the sea. But 6 weeks later, France beat the Third Coalition's butt at Austerlitz.
Oh, I'm so excited! I'm going to Austerlitz. They do a reenactment every year, and next year is the 220th anniversary of the Battle of Austerlitz, and I'm going to be in the Czech Republic at the end of November for that reenactment. Super excited.
Becoming the undisputed master of continental Europe, which made the war become a little awkward. Britain couldn't really get on land to finish off France, while France couldn't cross the sea to finish off Britain.
And other than once you get into the Peninsular War, a little bit after this, after what's happening right now, the British don't really participate with boots on the ground, so to speak. They're funding everyone else, and they're instigating all of this, and they're doing the naval blockade, but they're not really fighting on the ground with their own armies until Wellington's going to be fighting in Portugal and Spain.
So Britain issued a proclamation declaring a partial blockade on Europe. Oh yeah? You want to blockade me? I will blockade you!
Continental system.
Oh yeah, you can't blockade me. If I blockade you, no one can trade with you anymore unless they stop in Britain first and pay transit dues because I'm broke and I need money. Oh yeah? Then any neutral vessel that submits to your trade regulations or even permits one of your search parties on board will be subject to seizure. Oh yeah? Then I'm going to,
You see how this is just escalating, and it's bad for everybody. And there are all of these secondary reprisals that happen because of it. Because now what is happening between these countries in Europe is now affecting the rest of the world.
blockade you even harder. You guys know you're both violating international law, right?
Yep.
But he did it first! Both sides extensively looted neutral trade, and even though neither blockade was total, Americans saw great losses and had almost 1,000 ships seized from 1807 to 1812. This is outrageous! We are the United States of America! We will not be disrespected like this! We will embargo both of you! That will teach you some respect! The American commercial sanctions were incredibly effective at destroying their own economy, while the Europeans were barely hurt by them. In fact,
and the same thing happens when Napoleon does his continental system. It kind of hurts the British, but it really hurts the countries on the continent who can't import things.
The French used them as a pretext to seize even more American ships. In 1811, the frigate USS President was patrolling the American coast to prevent impressment when they spotted what they thought was the British HMS Guerriere, which had recently impressed a sailor from Maine. But their ship turned out to be the HMS Littlebelt, a much smaller ship. The ships exchanged fire, and the HMS Littlebelt was severely damaged and lost several sailors. Of course, both the British and Americans claimed to have responded to aggression from the other.
Han shot first.
Americans celebrated this as retribution for the Chesapeake incident, while many British demanded retaliation, although they decided to just let it go. But if the maritime situation was tense, the situation in the American West was even worse. American settlers had long been venturing into Native American land and violating treaties over and over again. This may sound bad, but you have to remember, American settlers were special. They were not like those dirty natives. No, no, no. They were chosen by God. It was their manifest destiny to kill the natives and steal their land, to spread democracy and capitalism from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This prompted many natives to seek an alliance with the British, who provided them with weapons and supplies.
And this has been an ongoing thing. This happened in what we call the French and Indian War, which is the 7 Years' War. It happened during the American Revolution. You have these Native American tribes who take sides. They're looking out for their own well-being and what's going to be best for them, which is what any nation does in a time of war, is what's going to be best for my nation, what's in my nation's best interest. But they're also looking how they can stick it to the people that they see as their enemies, even if that's other tribes at times.
Not because they care about them, no. But because they realized the natives could be valuable tools in case of another war with the Americans. So, as the Americans expanded westward, the natives' attacks increased in frequency and brutality. When the governor of Indiana was trying to raise Indiana to statehood through white settlement, two Native American brothers, the prophet Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh, began forming alliances to stop further land cessions. They established their base at Prophetstown and oversaw an increase in depredations against the invaders. Harrison led an army of 1,000 men, and in the Battle of Tippecanoe, forced the natives to retreat, although their depredations would continue.
And this is why when William Henry Harrison runs for president a few decades later, his slogan's going to be Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tyler was his vice presidential running mate. Tippecanoe was this famous battle that Harrison had won against the natives.
Many Americans, especially Republicans, saw the British as responsible for these attacks and felt that war was the only way to solve all their problems. Noticing the tensions, the British tried to improve relations with the Americans. In the spring of 1812, they ordered their navy to treat American ships with special tact and be very careful not to impress American citizens.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting because what you have now is you have an attempt to start dialing back the tension, but the tension has come to a boiling point. And it's because it didn't happen overnight, it's not going to be undone overnight. And unfortunately, in this case, by the time they start to try and scale this back, it's too late.
Alright mate, we'll suspend the Orders in Council and allow you to trade with Europe again if you agree to use British licenses. British licenses? What's next? Do you want us to surrender our independence? We fought a war to be free from you, dadgummit. On June 16, 2 days before the declaration of the war, the British offered to suspend the Orders in Council if the Americans dropped their ban on British imports. And without even waiting for an American response, they scrapped the entire system of blockades and licenses altogether.
But it takes weeks for communication to take place, right? Just like at the end of the War of 1812, the most significant American victory of the war is going to happen after the war is actually already over, but word hasn't made it back yet. Unfortunately, that's just the way this works out. If they had done this 3 months earlier, maybe it's a different story.
But they made a terrible job of announcing their decisions, and since the Americans had recalled their diplomats from London, the news didn't reach them until it was too late. And after pressure from war hawk politicians, President Madison decided to declare war on the British. But the Federalists strongly opposed the declaration of war, and after a Federalist newspaper declared itself against the war altogether, a series of brutal riots occurred in Baltimore.
Yeah, at this point, the Federalists have basically lost all of their influence, and like I said, they only have one presidential election that they win, and that's John Adams in 1796, and they never have another Federalist president after that.
To suppress any dissent of the war. Despite opposition, the US declared war on June 18, 1812, although the exact reasons and goals of the war are still uncertain and disputed. They decided to go after Canada, which
this is the first thought of the Americans in the Revolution: invade Canada. I mean, they launched an invasion within months of the beginning of the Revolutionary War. First thought in the War of 1812: let's get Canada. It's right there. It's, the British mainland is 3,000 miles across an ocean. You can't get at that. You can get at Canada though.
They had been ruling over since the Revolutionary War. The plan was to cut off the British from their native allies and take control of trade in the West Indies, hoping that the British would be unable to respond strongly to the invasion since Napoleon was preparing to invade Russia. And what could possibly go wrong? But even if permanently annexing Canada was not possible, taking it would, at the very least, serve as a strong bargaining chip against the Brits.
Yeah.
And they thought it would be relatively easy to take because of its smaller population, distance from the British Isles, and because they thought Canadians were eager to join the greatest country on the planet.
This is a mistake that is made throughout history. Oh, if we just march in, they're going to rise up and join our side. And so many times in history, they calculate that wrong. Not just the Americans, everybody does that.
But except for isolated riots, the majority of Canadians remained loyal to the British. The American strategy was to go for a three-pronged attack on Canada, with simultaneous fronts on Montreal, Detroit, and the Niagara. The US chose William Hull, the governor of Michigan and a veteran of the Revolutionary War, to lead the campaign in the West. Hull led an army of militia to Detroit and then moved on Fort Amherstburg, seizing the village of Sandwich. 200 of his men refused to follow him outside of US borders, but his force still vastly outnumbered the defenders. But he quickly became afraid of his supply lines being harassed by the British and their native allies, so he sent 200 men to reinforce it, who were then attacked by Tecumseh and forced to retreat to Detroit. The Canadians, led by General Isaac Brock, were strengthened by reinforcements and took an outpost in Mackinac Island, which led Hull to believe that he was being surrounded. He decided to retreat back to Detroit without ever attacking Fort Amherstburg. His troops lost faith in his leadership, and dissent grew to the point that his soldiers even considered mutiny. With the approaching enemy forces, Hull ordered the evacuation of Fort Dearborn. But Potomac warriors ambushed and massacred the soldiers.
And there are several of these massacres that happen on the frontier areas of the War of 1812.
Brock and his forces began a siege of Fort Detroit. Fearing a massacre by the Native Americans, Hull surrendered Detroit and his entire army without even consulting his officers. He was later court-martialed for cowardice.
There were actually people who made moves to have him executed for treason. That's how badly this had gone. I'm going to wrap it up right here, though. We're halfway through. We're just getting into the War of 1812 itself. It's a fascinating look that we're having so far. I've really enjoyed it. I think his presentation's been great, and I think he's got the issues fairly well and how he's kind of presented it all. So now we'll see how the war goes and how it all shakes out afterwards. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and we'll be back tomorrow with part 2. Thanks for watching.